May 14, 1945. 6:53 in the morning, southeast of Kyushu, Japan. Shipfitter second-class Norman Zaft climbed the ladder from the forward bomb elevator pit of USS Enterprise, his hands black with grease, his dungarees soaked with hydraulic fluid. He'd been working the overnight shift, alone in the machinery spaces 4 decks below the flight deck, when his shipmate George Barker had appeared at 0645. "Zaft, if you want to go and eat chow, I will relieve you early as I feel safer down here." Norman gratefully headed topside to the crew's mess. He stood in the chow line, exhausted, hungry, thinking about scrambled powdered eggs and coffee. At 0653, general quarters sounded. An instant later, the world exploded. George Barker, who had felt safer 4 decks below the waterline, died in Norman's place. The most decorated warship in United States Navy history, the carrier that had fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, the ship that critics said would never survive the war, had just been knocked out of the fight by a single Japanese pilot. Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu, 22 years old, rolled his Zeke fighter upside down and dove through a wall of anti-aircraft fire to crash through Enterprise's flight deck. The explosion hurled the 15-ton forward elevator 400 feet into the air. 14 men died. 68 were wounded. Yet within minutes, damage control teams were fighting fires, patching holes, and keeping the carrier in formation. The ship that everyone predicted would be sunk stayed afloat. The crew that should have abandoned ship stayed at their stations. And the damage control organization that military analysts called impossible to maintain under combat conditions performed a miracle that morning, saving not just a ship, but the legacy of the most famous fighting vessel America had ever built. The war in the Pacific had reached its most desperate phase by May of 1945. American forces had seized Iwo Jima in February after 36 days of savage fighting. 5,931 Marines died. 881 sailors perished. More than 20,000 Japanese defenders fought to the death. The cost was staggering. But Iwo Jima provided emergency landing fields for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan. It saved hundreds of American aircrews. Now the focus shifted to Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. The invasion began on April 1, 1945. It would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Japan's response was Operation Kikusui, Floating Chrysanthemum. Beginning on April 6, the Japanese launched 10 massive kamikaze attacks over 2.5 months. These weren't the desperate, improvised suicide missions of late 1944. These were organized, coordinated mass strikes involving hundreds of aircraft. Pilots received specific training in attack approaches. They studied carrier silhouettes. They learned to use clouds for concealment. They practiced the snap-roll maneuver that would steepen their dive at the last second. The goal was simple and terrible: overwhelm American combat air patrols and anti-aircraft defenses through sheer numbers. Accept a 93% loss rate to achieve a 7% hit rate. Trade 1 pilot and 1 obsolete aircraft for an American carrier worth $100 million and 3,000 trained sailors. The mathematics were brutal but logical. Japan had lost most of its veteran carrier pilots at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Training new pilots to the skill level required for conventional carrier operations took 18 months to 2 years. Japan didn't have 18 months, but training a pilot to take off, navigate to a target area, and dive straight down took 6 weeks. The kamikaze, as American sailors came to call them using the Japanese term for divine wind, were smart bombs before smart bombs existed. A human guidance system that could wait for the perfect moment, adjust for a target's evasive maneuvers, and guarantee a hit if the pilot reached his target. If he reached his target, that was the crucial question. By mid-May, American losses from kamikaze attacks were mounting. Between April 6 and May 14, suicide planes sank 36 ships and damaged 368 others. The escort carrier Bismarck C went down on February 21st with 318 men killed. The destroyer Luce sank on May 4th with 149 dead. Bunker Hill, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's flagship, was savaged on May 11th. 2 kamikazes hit within minutes. The first crashed into planes being fueled and armed on the flight deck. Aviation gasoline ignited. 5-inch ammunition cooked off. The second kamikaze plunged into the inferno. 346 men died. 43 went missing. 264 were wounded. Bunker Hill withdrew from combat. Her career effectively ended. USS Enterprise represented something different in the American carrier fleet. She was the oldest fleet carrier still fighting. Commissioned at Newport News, Virginia, on May 12, 1938, she had been designed before anyone truly understood carrier warfare. Her designers at the Bureau of Construction and Repair had studied the experiences of Langley, Lexington, and Saratoga, America's first carrier experiments. They'd increased displacement from 14,500 tons to 19,900 tons. They'd boosted speed from 29.5 knots to 32.5 knots. They'd created a ship that could launch and recover aircraft quickly, fight off surface threats with 8 5-inch guns, and survive damage that would sink lesser vessels. Enterprise proved her worth immediately. She was at sea conducting training exercises on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 18 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from her air group arrived over Oahu during the attack. 7 were shot down. 8 airmen died. 2 were wounded. Enterprise became the only American aircraft carrier with casualties at Pearl Harbor. 3 days later, her aircraft sank the Japanese submarine I-70, making her the first United States Navy warship to sink an enemy vessel in World War II. In the dark first months of the war, when every other American battleship lay on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, Enterprise became the symbol of American resistance. She covered the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942. She fought at Midway in June, her dive bombers helping to sink 3 Japanese carriers and turn the tide of the Pacific War. At the Eastern Solomons in August, she took 3 bomb hits and kept fighting. At the Santa Cruz Islands in October, 2 bombs struck her flight deck. Fires raged. 44 men died. 75 were wounded. The forward elevator jammed. Watertight integrity was compromised. 1 oil tank leaked continuously. Yet Enterprise's damage control teams brought her to Pearl Harbor under her own power. Repair crews worked around the clock. 16 days later, she was back in action, the only operational carrier in the South Pacific. At Guadalcanal, her aircraft helped sink the battleship Hia and the heavy cruiser Kinugasa. She provided the only effective American carrier air support during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, operating from positions 200 miles south of the fighting. By 1945, Enterprise had evolved into something unique. In December 1944, after returning to Pearl Harbor from supporting operations in the Philippines, she underwent modifications that transformed her into America's first dedicated night carrier. Her hull designation changed from CV-6 to CV-N-6. The N stood for night. She embarked Night Air Group 90, pilots specially trained to launch and land in complete darkness using only radar and radio direction. This was extraordinarily dangerous work. Joe Hranek, a crewman in Torpedo Squadron 90 Night, recalled, "I was never sure where we were until the pilot cut the engine and the deck lights suddenly appeared. All in all, it was sheer terror." But night operations gave Enterprise a crucial role. She could defend the fleet from Japanese night bombing attacks. She could provide continuous combat air patrol while day carriers cycled their aircraft. And she could launch nighttime strikes against Japanese airfields, catching planes on the ground before they could launch kamikaze missions. On May 11, 1945, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher watched his flagship Bunker Hill burn. He'd been on the carrier's bridge when the first kamikaze hit. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead. Flames swept the bridge. Mitcher, 69 years old, one of the most experienced carrier commanders in naval history, evacuated to a destroyer and then transferred his flag to Enterprise. The symbolism was powerful. The newest, most advanced carrier in Task Force 58 had been knocked out. Command shifted to the oldest, the carrier that had been fighting since the war's first day. Mitchell immediately ordered intensified attacks against the Kamikaze airfields on Kyushu. Enterprise would lead the strikes. On the nights of May 12th through 13th and May 13th through 14th, Enterprise launched repeated missions against Japanese air bases. Her Avenger torpedo bombers and Hellcat fighters hit Naval Air Station Kanoya with general-purpose bombs, incendiary clusters, and rockets. They cratered runways. They destroyed hangars. They strafed parked aircraft. The goal was to catch kamikaze pilots on the ground before they could launch. But the attacks came too late. On the morning of May 14th, before dawn, 28 Mitsubishi A6M5 Model 52C Zeke fighters took off from Kanoya. They belonged to the 6th Tsukuba, 11th Kenmu, and 8th Shikisho squadrons. Each carried a single 250-kilogram bomb. Each pilot had written farewell letters to his family. Each had been given a final meal. Each knew he would not return. The Japanese attack plan was sophisticated. The 28 Zekes would approach Task Force 58 from different altitudes and directions. They would use cloud cover to avoid radar detection and fighter patrols. They would time their final dives to overwhelm the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft defenses. If even 3 or 4 pilots successfully hit carriers, the mission would be considered a success. The Americans were expecting exactly this kind of attack. Enterprise had gone to general quarters at 0357 after receiving reports of Japanese aircraft in the vicinity. The entire task force was at battle stations. Combat air patrols circled overhead. Radar operators studied their scopes. 5-inch gun crews stood ready. 40mm and 20mm gunners scanned the sky. The carrier maneuvered continuously, changing course every few minutes to complicate targeting calculations. At 0653, Enterprise's guns opened fire on a plane approaching from starboard. Captain Grover Bradley Hazen Hall, commanding officer since December 14, 1944, ordered an emergency turn to port. The carrier heeled hard left, her 32-knot speed and 19,900-ton displacement creating a turning radius measured in thousands of yards. But the Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tamiyasu, had studied American carrier tactics. He knew Enterprise would turn. He'd positioned his approach to compensate. Tamiyasu maneuvered through the clouds, diving from approximately 1,500 feet at a 30-degree angle. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around him. 5-inch shells burst in black puffs. 40mm tracers drew red lines through the dawn. 20mm rounds sparked off his Zeke's wings and fuselage. 200 yards from the ship, with every gun on Enterprise's starboard side firing directly at him, Tamiyasu executed a left-hand snap roll. His Zeke flipped upside down. The maneuver steepened his dive to 45 degrees. Sunlight gleamed off the fighter's aluminum underside as it plummeted toward the flight deck. Tamiyasu aimed for the forward elevator, the largest clear opening in Enterprise's armored flight deck. He struck just aft of the elevator, slightly to port of centerline. The Zeke's 250-kilogram bomb punched through the 3-inch thick wooden flight deck. The aircraft disintegrated. The engine, weighing more than 1,200 pounds, crashed through the flight deck, nicked the lower flange of a transverse structural beam at frame 40, punched through the hangar deck, and came to rest in the forward elevator pit on the second deck. The bomb separated from the wreckage and penetrated the elevator pit. It detonated high order in compartment A305A, a stowage area on the third deck containing cleaning rags soaked in gasoline and oil. The explosion occurred 6 decks below the flight deck in a confined space surrounded by fuel tanks, ammunition magazines, and crew berthing. The blast wave propagated upward through the elevator shaft with the force of 350 pounds of high explosive. The forward elevator, weighing 15 tons, was hurled 400 feet into the air on a plume of smoke and flame. The elevator's steel decking, approximately 35 feet by 48 feet, pulled away from its supporting framework. Three-quarters of the decking rose intact like a playing card flipped skyward. It reached its apex, hesitated, and plunged into the sea 400 feet from the ship. The remaining quarter of the decking, the peripheral girders, and the brackets for the steadying rails crashed onto the flight deck forward and aft of the elevator opening, smashing aircraft and killing men caught in the open. 4 decks below, George Barker died instantly. He'd relieved Norman Zaft in the forward elevator machinery spaces at 0645, just 8 minutes before the attack. The explosion and fire killed him and 13 others. Among the dead were 3 officers whose staterooms surrounded the elevator shaft. Their quarters simply ceased to exist, demolished by blast pressure that exceeded 500 pounds per square inch. In the crew berthing areas around the elevator, bunks and lockers were destroyed. Watertight doors on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th decks were blown off their hinges. The carpenter shop was wrecked. The brig, ironically one of the most heavily reinforced spaces on the ship, was demolished. The crew's washroom and sick bay flooded when drainage systems backed up. The blast wave continued upward into the hangar deck. Despite the large venting area provided by the elevator opening in the flight deck, the explosion's force was immense. The flight deck bulged upward across the entire width of the ship, rising 3 feet 6 inches at frame 46. Stanchions between the main deck and second deck were torn loose at their bases but remained attached to the overhead, creating a forest of twisted steel columns. Transverse bulkheads at frames 157 and 173 were distorted and torn. The hangar deck curtains, heavy canvas barriers designed to contain fires, were blown out back to frame 140. Aircraft parked in the forward hangar exploded as aviation gasoline ignited. The fire spread rapidly through pools of fuel on the hangar deck. Above on the flight deck, the scene was apocalyptic. The forward elevator opening, normally covered by the elevator platform, gaped like a wound. Flames shot 200 feet into the air. Aircraft parked forward of the elevator caught fire. Their fuel tanks exploded. Their ammunition cooked off. 5-inch shells stored in ready-service lockers in the gun galleries detonated from the heat. The blast from one ammunition explosion blew a 12-foot by 6-foot hole in the starboard bulkhead of the elevator trunk and an 18-foot by 8-foot hole in the gallery deck. Guns number 5 and 7 in the Group 3 5-inch battery were wrecked, their instruments destroyed, their ammunition hoists disabled. The splinter shield between the guns was torn loose and bent aft. The sponson shield for gun number 5 was blown out completely. Power failures cascaded through the ship. A bank of transformers mounted under the flight deck directly in the path of the bomb and aircraft disintegrated. The Mark 14 sights for 20mm batteries 1, 2, and 4 lost power. 5-inch gun groups 1 and 2 went dark. 40mm mounts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 lost power when their supply cables were severed in the elevator trunk. The Mark 37 directors that controlled the 40mm guns failed. 5-inch ammunition hoists stopped when shock damage grounded limit switches and salt water flooded control circuits. 68 men were wounded by fragments, blast pressure, burns, and falling debris. The carrier's combat effectiveness was severely compromised, but Enterprise stayed in formation. She maintained 32 knots, and her crew began fighting to save her. The Damage Control Organization aboard Enterprise in May 1945 represented the culmination of 4 years of hard lessons. After the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, when bombs had nearly sent her to the bottom, the ship's leadership had instituted a comprehensive overhaul of damage control procedures. They'd stripped the ship of flammable materials. Linoleum was removed from all decks. Paint was stripped down to bare metal in critical areas. Wooden furniture was sent ashore. Overstuffed furniture and cushions were disposed of. Office files were reduced to absolute minimums. Libraries were culled. The policy was established. Only 1 week's supply of flammable materials could be stored above the waterline. Fire-resistant paint and fiberglass insulation were installed on the inside of the island structure. The crew trained constantly. Every man knew his damage control station. Every man understood the layout of fire mains, electrical systems, ventilation ducts, and watertight compartments. When the Kamikaze hit at 0653, the damage control parties were already at their stations. General quarters had sounded minutes before. Men were in position. They moved immediately. On the hangar deck, firefighting teams charged into smoke and flames. They dragged fire hoses toward the burning aircraft. They activated the hangar deck sprinkler system, designed to drench the entire space with seawater. They established boundaries, preventing the fire from spreading aft. In the spaces below the hangar deck, damage control teams checked for flooding, shored up weakened bulkheads, and secured ruptured piping. They pumped gasoline and water out of compartments where the two had mixed, creating an explosive vapor. The fourth deck had dished downward in compartment D4193A from the starboard shell to the inboard bulkhead. Transverse bulkheads were deflected and holed, but watertight integrity below the third deck held. There was no measurable reduction in buoyancy or stability. On the flight deck, repair parties moved toward the gaping elevator opening. The hole measured approximately 35 feet by 48 feet. Flames roared up from the hangar deck below. The heat was intense enough to blister paint on the island structure 80 feet away, but the repair crews had prepared for exactly this scenario. They'd prefabricated steel plates in the ship's workshops. They'd drilled nail holes at 6-inch intervals around the plate edges. They'd cut 60-penny nails to a length of 2.5 inches. Now they dragged 2 plates, each measuring 6 feet by 9 feet by 3/8 of an inch thick, to the edge of the hole. Working in the heat and smoke, they hammered the plates down over the opening, nailing them directly into the wooden flight deck. The wooden deck was on fire. The nails went in anyway. They secured a second pair of plates over the hole in the elevator pit below. Smaller fragment holes across the flight deck were covered with pieces of 1/8 inch plate, 24 inches by 12 inches or 18 inches square. All were nailed down using the same technique. This improvised repair work violated every principle of proper shipfitting. The plates weren't welded. They weren't bolted. They were nailed to a wooden deck that was actively burning. The seal wasn't watertight. The structure wasn't load-bearing, but the goal wasn't perfection. The goal was to suppress the fire below and restore the flight deck to operation. Within 1 hour of the Kamikaze strike, aircraft were landing on Enterprise's patched deck. The carrier remained in formation with Task Group 58.3. Her speed never dropped below 30 knots. To an observer on another ship, Enterprise appeared only lightly damaged, a smoking flight deck but still operational. Reality below decks told a different story. The forward elevator machinery was completely destroyed. The elevator could not be raised or lowered. The opening remained covered only by hastily nailed steel plates. The hangar deck was charred and buckled. 3 officers' staterooms no longer existed. Crew berthing spaces were demolished. The brig was gone. The carpenter shop was wrecked. The forward 5-inch guns were disabled. Electrical systems throughout the forward part of the ship were damaged or destroyed. And yet Enterprise fought. At 0745, less than an hour after Tomiyasu's attack, another wave of kamikazes approached Task Force 58. Enterprise's remaining guns opened fire. Her combat air patrol engaged the attackers. 2 more suicide planes were shot down near the task group. A third crashed within yards of Enterprise's hull, close enough that the explosion wrenched her structure and caused additional casualties. 1 man died. 18 were wounded, but no more kamikazes hit the carrier. By 0830, the immediate threat had passed. Enterprise had survived. Her crew had saved her, and the ship that critics had predicted would be sunk in the war's first months had just fought off her 6th major damage-inflicting attack and remained afloat. The human cost of May 14th was terrible but could have been catastrophic. 14 men died. 68 were wounded. Compare this to Bunker Hill 3 days earlier. 346 dead, 43 missing, 264 wounded, or Franklin on March 19th when 2 bombs killed 724 men and wounded 265 others, or Bismarck C on February 21st, sunk with 318 dead. Enterprise's casualties were a fraction of what they should have been given the severity of the damage. The explosion occurred in one of the most densely packed areas of the ship, surrounded by crew berthing, fuel tanks, ammunition magazines, and machinery spaces. The blast equivalent of 350 pounds of TNT detonated 6 decks below the waterline. The forward elevator was hurled 400 feet into the air. The flight deck buckled across its entire width. Yet only 14 men died. Credit belonged to the Damage Control Organization and to the specific decisions made in Enterprise's design and modification. The elevator shaft, while not designed as a blast vent, functioned as one. The explosion's force propagated upward through the shaft rather than outward through the hull. This prevented catastrophic flooding. The watertight integrity below the third deck held, preventing tons of firefighting water from flooding lower compartments and compromising stability. The fire-resistant paint and fiberglass insulation on the island structure prevented fires from spreading through the superstructure. The hangar deck sprinkler system activated automatically, suppressing the aviation gasoline fire before it could reach aft toward additional parked aircraft. And the crew's training, their instant response, their willingness to charge into fires and smoke with hoses and patches and hammers, made the difference between survival and loss. Norman Zaft survived because George Barker had relieved him 8 minutes before the attack. Zaft was in the crew's mess, standing in the chow line when the explosion occurred. He felt the deck heave beneath his feet. He heard the roar. He ran toward his damage control station. Later, as a member of the Construction and Repair Division, he gained access to the bottom of the elevator well. He found a small piece of Tomiyasu's Zeke, part of the fuselage. Another shipfitter recovered a section of the propeller blade. Zaft sawed off a small piece, polished one side, and engraved on it, USS Enterprise, May 14, 1945. It was his only souvenir of the day his friend died in his place. Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu was 22 years old. He was born in 1923 in Japan's Saga Prefecture. He'd graduated from the Imperial Japanese Navy Academy and had trained as a carrier pilot before Japan's carrier fleet was destroyed at Philippine Sea. Reassigned to land-based kamikaze units, he'd been selected for the May 14th mission based on his superior flying skills. His orders were explicit: approach from cloud cover, use surprise, aim for the elevator, execute the snap roll to steepen the dive, do not miss. Tomiyasu followed his orders perfectly. He was the only pilot among the 28 who launched from Kanoya that morning to successfully complete his mission. The other 27 were shot down by combat air patrol fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Tomiyasu's body was found in the bottom of the forward elevator well, along with his aircraft's engine. In the pockets of his flight suit were calling cards bearing his name. For decades, Americans believed his name was Tomi Zai, a transliteration error. Researchers eventually identified him correctly as Shunsuke Tomiyasu. In 2007, more than 60 years after the attack, Tomiyasu's younger brother Hideo was contacted by Joel Shepard, secretary of the USS Enterprise CV6 Association, through the efforts of Japanese researchers. Hideo learned the details of his brother's final moments. He told the researchers that Shunsuke must have been satisfied to successfully complete his mission. In those days, when a kamikaze pilot left on a sortie, he was determined to hit the target. Hideo asked that people remember all the other pilots who took off from Kanoya that morning, who cooperated with and supported his brother, even though only Shunsuke distinguished himself by hitting a target. A piece of Tomiyasu's aircraft, recovered from Enterprise, is now displayed at the Kanoya Naval Air Station Museum. The description explains that 22-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu, with a high spirit of patriotism, followed the extraordinary command to die for his country and crashed into USS Enterprise, successfully accomplishing his sure death, one-way mission. On May 16, 1945, 2 days after the Kamikaze attack, Enterprise withdrew from Task Force 58. Her combat career was over. She steamed first to Pearl Harbor, arriving to a hero's welcome. The crew rigged an enormous pennant, 578 feet long. 1 foot for every day since she'd left Bremerton Navy Yard in November 1943. The pennant streamed behind the carrier as she entered Pearl Harbor, visible for miles, a defiant statement that the oldest carrier in the fleet had survived the newest and most terrible threat the enemy could devise. From Pearl Harbor, Enterprise sailed to Puget Sound Navy Yard, arriving on June 7th. Repairs began immediately but proceeded slowly. The forward elevator had to be completely rebuilt. The flight deck required extensive reconstruction. Electrical systems throughout the forward section needed replacement. Hull frames damaged by near-miss explosions required reinforcement. The work continued through June and July and into August. On August 9, 1945, Enterprise was at the degaussing and demagnetizing range off the Strait of Juan de Fuca, fully restored to peak condition, with all aircraft embarked, ready to return to combat. That day, an atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. 5 days later, on August 14th, Japan announced its surrender. Enterprise never returned to war. She had fought from December 7, 1941 to May 14, 1945. 3 years, 5 months, and 7 days of continuous combat operations, 20 major engagements, more actions against Japanese forces than any other United States warship. She'd been damaged by enemy action in 6 separate incidents. She'd survived 3 bomb hits at Eastern Solomons, 2 bomb hits at Santa Cruz, 1 bomb hit in March 1945, 2 kamikaze attacks in April and May 1945. She'd lost hundreds of crew members. She'd launched thousands of sorties. Her aircraft had sunk dozens of enemy ships, and she had never once been forced to withdraw to a rear area for extended repairs until that final morning off Okinawa. Enterprise's post-war service reflected both honor and tragedy. She participated in Operation Magic Carpet, bringing American servicemen home from Europe. On her first voyage to Southampton, England, in November 1945, she embarked 4. By early 1946, the United States Navy had commissioned more than 24 Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than Enterprise. The Yorktown-class design was obsolete. Enterprise entered New York Naval Shipyard on January 18, 1946, for deactivation. She was decommissioned on February 17, 1947. Plans were announced to preserve her as a museum ship in New York. Fundraising efforts began. But the necessary money, approximately $2 million, could not be raised. Subsequent preservation attempts also failed. On July 1, 1958, Enterprise was sold to the Lipset Corporation of New York City for scrapping at Kearny, New Jersey. A promise was made to save her distinctive tripod mast for installation in the Naval Academy's new football stadium. That promise was never fulfilled. Instead, a memorial plaque was installed at the base of what is still called Enterprise Tower. The legacy of USS Enterprise extends far beyond her combat record. She demonstrated that a pre-war carrier design, properly maintained and continuously modified, could remain effective throughout a war that saw revolutionary changes in naval aviation. She proved that damage control, properly organized and rigorously trained, could save a ship from damage that would sink vessels with less prepared crews. She showed that age and obsolescence could be overcome by crew quality and institutional knowledge, and she established principles that influenced American carrier design for decades. The importance of armored flight decks, the value of comprehensive damage control training, the necessity of multiple redundant systems for power, steering, and fire suppression, the criticality of damage control as a warfighting function, not an afterthought. Enterprise received 20 battle stars for her World War II service, more than any other United States warship. She received the Presidential Unit Citation. She received the British Admiralty Pennant. She was recommended for the Medal of Honor, an award that can only be given to individuals, not ships. Her crew received countless individual decorations: Navy crosses, silver stars, bronze stars, Purple Hearts. More than 200 men died aboard Enterprise during the war. Hundreds more were wounded. Thousands served aboard her, from December 1941 to August 1945, through the darkest days when America stood nearly alone, and through the final victorious months when Japan's defeat was certain. They saved her 6 times. They brought her home, and then they watched her be scrapped because America couldn't find $2 million to preserve the ship that had, more than any other single vessel, defeated Japan at sea. The Kamikaze attack of May 14, 1945, was not the most damaging strike Enterprise endured. The bomb hits at Santa Cruz in October 1942 killed more men and caused worse structural damage. But the May attack was symbolically the most significant because it ended Enterprise's combat career. The oldest American fleet carrier, the carrier that had fought longer than any other, the carrier that critics said would never survive, was finally knocked out of the war. Not sunk. Not crippled beyond repair. Simply damaged enough that by the time repairs were complete, the war was over. Tomiyasu succeeded in his mission. He hit his target. His bomb exploded. The forward elevator was destroyed. But he did not sink Enterprise. And that failure, from the Japanese perspective, symbolized everything that went wrong with the Kamikaze strategy. The Kamikaze was a weapon born of desperation. It accepted catastrophic losses, 93% of pilots killed, to achieve a 7% hit rate. It traded irreplaceable trained men for temporary damage to ships that could be repaired. It inflicted horrible casualties on American sailors but rarely sank major combatants. Between October 1944 and August 1945, Kamikazes sank 49 ships. 3 were escort carriers. None were fleet carriers. None were battleships. None were cruisers. The vast majority were destroyers, destroyer escorts, and amphibious vessels. Meanwhile, Japan lost more than 4,000 pilots and aircraft, many of them the last trained aviators the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Every kamikaze that hit a destroyer was a bomber that couldn't attack a troop transport or a fighter that couldn't defend Japanese cities from B-29 raids. Enterprise survived because her crew refused to accept that a single attacking aircraft could sink a 19,900-ton warship. They prepared for the worst. They trained constantly. They stripped their ship of flammable materials. They prefabricated repair patches. They practiced damage control under realistic conditions. When Tomiyasu's bomb exploded 6 decks below the waterline, they responded instantly. They fought fires. They patched holes. They shored up bulkheads. They restored power. They nailed steel plates to a burning deck and then landed aircraft on those plates. They accepted 14 dead and 68 wounded as the price of keeping their ship afloat and operational. And they succeeded because they understood something that the kamikaze strategy ignored. Ships don't fight. Crews fight. And the crew of USS Enterprise was the finest damage control organization in the United States Navy. George Barker, shipfitter second class, died in the forward elevator machinery spaces at 0653 on May 14, 1945. He was one of 14 men killed when Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu's bomb detonated. Norman Zaft, who should have died in Barker's place, survived the war. He carried the guilt of that exchange for the rest of his life. Decades later, he would tell the story to his children and grandchildren. George Barker had felt safer in the machinery spaces 4 decks below the waterline. He'd relieved Zaft 8 minutes early. Those 8 minutes were the difference between life and death. Zaft kept a small piece of Tomiyasu's aircraft for the rest of his life, a reminder that survival in war often comes down to chance, timing, and the selfless decisions of shipmates who don't live to see the war's end. The damage control response on May 14 demonstrated principles that became foundational to American naval architecture and training. Within minutes of the explosion, repair parties were fighting fires in compartments filled with smoke and toxic fumes. They worked without adequate lighting when power failed. They improvised solutions when standard equipment was destroyed. They communicated using sound-powered phones when electrical systems went dark. They established boundaries to prevent fires from spreading, sacrificing forward compartments to save the rest of the ship. And they did this while the carrier maneuvered at high speed, while additional kamikaze attacks threatened, while their shipmates lay dead and wounded around them. This was damage control under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable. The technical analysis of the May 14th attack revealed crucial insights about kamikaze tactics and carrier vulnerability. Tomiyasu had aimed for the forward elevator, one of 3 such openings in Enterprise's flight deck. The elevator measured approximately 35 feet by 48 feet, a target area of 1,680 square feet. Enterprise's total flight deck measured 827 feet by 86 feet, an area of approximately 71,122 square feet. The elevator represented 2.36% of the total flight deck area. Yet Tomiyasu hit within feet of this target while diving at 45 degrees through intensive anti-aircraft fire. His accuracy was remarkable and validated Japanese kamikaze training methods. The snap-roll maneuver that steepened his dive also made his aircraft nearly impossible to hit in the final seconds. Anti-aircraft gunners had to lead a target moving at 300 miles per hour in a constantly changing trajectory. The physics worked against the defenders. But Tomiyasu's technical success produced strategic failure. His bomb penetrated 6 decks and detonated in an optimal location for maximum damage. The explosion destroyed the forward elevator machinery, damaged or destroyed hundreds of compartments, killed 14 men, wounded 68 others, and knocked Enterprise out of the war. Yet the carrier remained afloat. She maintained formation. She continued launching and recovering aircraft within the hour. She withdrew under her own power 2 days later. She was fully repaired and ready to return to combat within 90 days. From the Japanese perspective, the exchange was catastrophic. 1 trained pilot killed, 1 aircraft destroyed, 1 250-kilogram bomb expended. Result: temporary damage to 1 carrier that was back in service before Japan surrendered. This mathematics explained why Japan lost the war. Compare Enterprise's survival to the loss of Japanese carriers at Midway, Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. At Midway in June 1942, American dive bombers hit Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with perhaps 15 bombs total across 3 carriers. All 3 were abandoned and sank. At Philippine Sea in June 1944, Shikaku took 3 torpedo hits and sank in 3 hours. Teiho took 1 torpedo hit and exploded 7 hours later from aviation gasoline vapors that accumulated in unventilated spaces. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Zuikaku absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits but remained afloat for hours, finally capsizing because damage control teams couldn't manage flooding. Japanese carriers lacked the comprehensive damage control organization that American carriers developed through hard experience. They lacked the training. They lacked the equipment. They lacked the institutional culture that made damage control a primary warfighting function rather than a secondary maintenance task. Enterprise's crew understood that keeping the ship afloat was everyone's responsibility. Pilots trained in damage control, cooks trained in firefighting, clerks trained in shoring bulkheads, radio men trained in pumping flooded compartments. Officers led damage control parties personally, working alongside enlisted men in smoke-filled spaces. This culture came from the top. Captain Grover Hall, commanding officer during the May 14th attack, had previously served as executive officer. He'd overseen the damage control reorganization after Santa Cruz. He'd instituted the training programs. He'd mandated the removal of flammable materials. He'd prepositioned repair equipment throughout the ship. When Tomiyasu's bomb exploded, Hall's preparation paid immediate dividends. The crew knew what to do. They had the tools to do it, and they executed under fire. The statistical record of Enterprise's combat career provides objective validation of her crew's effectiveness. From December 1941 to May 1945, she participated in every major American offensive in the Pacific except the Battle of the Coral Sea. At Midway, her dive bombers sank Kaga and scored critical hits on Akagi. At Eastern Solomons, she took 3 bomb hits and shot down 71 Japanese aircraft. At Santa Cruz, she absorbed 2 bomb hits, launched aircraft continuously, and covered the withdrawal of Hornet survivors after that carrier was sunk. At Guadalcanal, operating as the only American carrier in the South Pacific, her aircraft provided continuous support to Marines ashore and sank the battleship Hiei. During the Gilbert Islands campaign, she launched strikes against Tarawa, Makin, and Nauru. At Kwajalein, her aircraft destroyed Japanese positions across the Marshall Islands. At Truk, she participated in the massive carrier raid that neutralized Japan's most important forward base. At the Marianas Turkey Shoot during the Battle of Philippine Sea, Enterprise's aircraft shot down dozens of Japanese planes in the largest carrier air battle in history. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she launched strikes against the Japanese center force, hitting the super battleship Yamato and helping to turn back Admiral Takeo Kurita's attempt to destroy the American landing forces. During the Iwo Jima campaign, her aircraft provided close air support to Marines fighting ashore. At Okinawa, she conducted strikes against kamikaze airfields, intercepted suicide attacks, and maintained continuous combat air patrol. In total, Enterprise's aircraft sank or damaged over 30 Japanese warships, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, and supported ground operations across thousands of miles of ocean. No other American warship matched this record. Her survival rate was equally impressive. 6 major damage incidents over 42 months of combat. Average time out of action for repairs, 16 days. Compare this to contemporary carriers. Yorktown sunk at Midway after 3 days of combat following emergency repairs from Coral Sea damage. Hornet sunk at Santa Cruz after less than a year of service. Lexington sunk at Coral Sea. Wasp torpedoed and sunk in September 1942. Princeton sunk at Leyte Gulf by a single bomb hit. These losses weren't caused by inferior design. They resulted from catastrophic damage that overwhelmed damage control capabilities, inadequate crew training, or simply bad luck. Enterprise survived because her crew made survival possible through preparation, training, and execution. The evolution of Enterprise's air group reflected broader changes in carrier aviation during the war. In December 1941, she embarked Bombing Squadron 6, Scouting Squadron 6, Fighting Squadron 6, and Torpedo Squadron 6. These squadrons flew Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers, and Grumman Wildcat fighters. The Devastator was obsolete by 1942. Slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable, it was replaced by the Grumman Avenger. The Wildcat was outmatched by Japanese Zero fighters in speed and maneuverability, but was more rugged and better armed. It was eventually replaced by the Grumman Hellcat, which dominated Japanese fighters from mid-1943 onward. The Dauntless remained Enterprise's primary strike aircraft until 1944, when it was replaced by the Curtiss Helderver. In December 1944, Enterprise became the Navy's first night carrier, embarking Night Air Group 90 with specially trained pilots and radar-equipped Avengers and Hellcats. The night operations conducted by Enterprise from December 1944 to May 1945 represented a revolution in carrier warfare. Previous night flying had been limited to emergency situations or combat air patrol by individual fighters. Enterprise pioneered systematic night strike operations. Her pilots launched in complete darkness, navigated to targets using only radar and dead reckoning, attacked Japanese airfields and shipping, and returned to land on a darkened carrier deck using radio direction and brief deck lighting visible only at the last moment. This was extraordinarily dangerous. Multiple aircraft were lost to navigation errors, mechanical failures, and landing accidents. but night operations gave the fleet crucial capabilities. Enterprise could maintain continuous combat air patrol, preventing Japanese night torpedo attacks that had devastated American task forces earlier in the war. She could strike Japanese airfields at night, catching kamikaze aircraft on the ground before they could launch. And she could maintain combat effectiveness during nighttime hours when day carriers were vulnerable. The technological innovations developed for Enterprise's night operations influenced carrier aviation for decades. Radar altimeters allowed pilots to judge their altitude during landing approaches in complete darkness. Radio homing beacons guided aircraft back to the carrier. Air search radar detected incoming threats at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Identification friend or foe transponders distinguished American aircraft from Japanese attackers. These systems, primitive by later standards, established the foundation for all-weather carrier operations. By the Korean War, Essex-class carriers routinely conducted night operations. By Vietnam, aircraft carriers operated around the clock in all-weather conditions. The learning curve began aboard Enterprise in the winter of 1944, when pilots like Lieutenant Commander William Ingram Henry led the first systematic night carrier strikes in naval history. Henry commanded Night Air Group 90, the squadron that operated from Enterprise during her final combat deployment. Born in 1917, he'd learned to fly in the late 1930s and had served as a flight instructor before transitioning to combat operations. Night flying required different skills than day operations. Pilots had to trust their instruments completely. They had to navigate by dead reckoning when weather-obscured radar returns. They had to suppress the natural fear of launching from a ship into absolute darkness with no visual references. Henry trained his pilots rigorously, starting with dusk flights and gradually moving to full nighttime operations. By December 1944, Night Air Group 90 was ready for combat. They flew their first strikes against Japanese positions in the Philippines on December 18th. They attacked targets on Luzon, Formosa, and Okinawa through January, February, and March 1945. They provided the combat air patrol that protected the task force during the Okinawa invasion, and they were aboard Enterprise on May 14th when Tomiyasu's Kamikaze ended the carrier's war. The aircraft parked on Enterprise's flight deck, and in her hangar on the morning of May 14th, represented a cross-section of naval aviation in 1945. Grumman F-6F-5N Hellcat night fighters, equipped with AN/APS-6 radar in a pod mounted on the starboard wing. Grumman TBM-3D Avenger night torpedo bombers, fitted with AN/APS-4 search radar in a ventral radome. These aircraft were specifically configured for night operations, painted in overall gloss sea blue, stripped of unnecessary weight, and crewed by pilots with hundreds of hours of night flying experience. Several aircraft were destroyed when Tomiyasu's bomb exploded. The forward elevator hurled debris across the flight deck. Falling steel crushed parked aircraft. Aviation gasoline fires consumed others. The exact number of aircraft destroyed varies in different accounts, but at least 6 planes were total losses, with others damaged but repairable. The cost-benefit analysis of the May 14th attack demonstrates the fundamental flaw in Japan's kamikaze strategy. One Mitsubishi A6M5 Zeke cost approximately $25,000 to manufacture at 1945 exchange rates. Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu had received approximately 3 years of training at substantial cost. His death removed from the Japanese military a trained officer who could never be replaced. The 250-kilogram bomb cost perhaps $500. Total Japanese investment, approximately $50,000 in equipment, training, and personnel. American losses, 14 dead, 68 wounded, 1 carrier temporarily disabled, 6 aircraft destroyed. Enterprise cost approximately $20 million to build. Her repairs cost approximately $1 million. 6 aircraft at $50,000 each totaled $300,000. Total material loss, $1.3 million, but Enterprise was back in service within 90 days. Her crew was intact except for 14 men. Her combat capability was restored. Japan had invested $50,000 and one trained pilot to inflict $1.3 million in damage that was fully repaired before the war ended. Scale this exchange across the entire Kamikaze campaign. 4,000 Japanese pilots killed, 4,000 aircraft destroyed. Investment, approximately $200 million in equipment and training. Result, 49 American ships sunk, mostly small vessels. Approximately 4,900 American sailors killed, thousands more wounded, dozens of carriers, battleships, and cruisers damaged. But only 3 escort carriers sunk, no fleet carriers sunk, no battleships sunk, no cruisers sunk. The American fleet's combat capability was never seriously compromised. Every damaged carrier was either repaired or replaced by new construction. By August 1945, the United States Navy had more operational carriers than in April 1945 despite months of kamikaze attacks. Japan had fewer aircraft, fewer pilots, and no possibility of replacing either. The mathematics were unforgiving. The human dimension of the kamikaze war is impossible to quantify. 4,900 American sailors died in kamikaze attacks. Each death created ripples of grief that spread through families, communities, and the nation. 4,000 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks. Each death was mourned by parents, siblings, wives, and children who would never see their sons and husbands and fathers again. Shunsuke Tomiyasu left behind his younger brother Hideo, who spent 62 years not knowing the details of his brother's death. When Hideo finally learned the full story in 2007, he expressed satisfaction that Shunsuke had successfully completed his mission. This sentiment reflected the depth of Japanese military culture, where duty and honor superseded life itself. But it also revealed the tragedy. Tomiyasu's successful mission accomplished nothing strategically. Enterprise survived. America won the war. Japan was destroyed. 22-year-old Shunsuke Tomiyasu died for a lost cause, following orders that made no military sense, in a strategic campaign that accelerated Japan's defeat rather than delaying it. The final statistics of USS Enterprise's combat career tell the story more clearly than any narrative. From December 7, 1941 to May 14, 1945, 1,305 days of commissioned service during wartime, 911 days deployed forward of Pearl Harbor, 20 major engagements, over 400 aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, over 30 warships sunk or damaged, 71 enemy aircraft shot down at Eastern Solomons, participation in sinking 4 carriers at Midway, support to Marines at Guadalcanal, night carrier operations from December 1944 to May 1945, 20 battle stars, Presidential Unit Citation, British Admiralty Pennant, 6 major damage incidents, 0 days sunk, 0 days withdrawn to rear area for extended repairs until May 1945, 211 crewmen killed in action. Hundreds more wounded, thousands served, all survived. The post-war fate of Enterprise remains controversial among naval historians and veterans. She was the most decorated warship in United States Navy history. She had fought longer than any other American carrier. Her combat record was unmatched. Yet she was scrapped in 1958 because $2 million couldn't be raised to preserve her as a museum. Compare this to contemporary carriers. Yorktown, sunk at Midway, was commemorated by naming a new Essex-class carrier CV-10 Yorktown. That ship now serves as a museum in Charleston, South Carolina. Lexington, sunk at Coral Sea, was commemorated by naming CV-16 Lexington. That ship now serves as a museum in Corpus Christi, Texas. Hornet, sunk at Santa Cruz, was commemorated by naming CV-12 Hornet. That ship now serves as a museum in Alameda, California. Intrepid, An Essex-class carrier with an impressive combat record but fewer battle stars than Enterprise, serves as a museum in New York City. But Enterprise, CV-6, the Big E, the Gray Ghost, the ship that fought at Midway and Guadalcanal and Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, was cut apart for scrap metal. The 8th United States Navy ship to bear the name Enterprise was commissioned in 1961. CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, served for 51 years before decommissioning in 2012. She inherited the legacy of CV-6, displaying a commemorative plaque that read, "The first Enterprise sailed the 7 seas defending our country. The 8th Enterprise will patrol the skies guarding the freedom of space." CVN-80, currently under construction, will become the 9th Enterprise. She will be the 3rd carrier of the Gerald R. Ford class, incorporating the most advanced technology in naval aviation. She will carry the battle honors of CV-6 into the 21st century. But the original Enterprise, the carrier that earned those honors through 3 years and 5 months of continuous combat, exists only in photographs, documents, and the memories of the few remaining crew members. Norman Zaft returned home after the war. He married, raised a family, and worked as a shipfitter in civilian life. He never forgot May 14, 1945. He never forgot George Barker, the shipmate who had relieved him early because he felt safer in the machinery spaces 4 decks below the waterline. Zaft kept the small piece of Tomiyasu's aircraft that he'd recovered from the elevator well. He polished it. He engraved it. He showed it to his children and grandchildren. And he told them the story of the day Enterprise was nearly sunk, the day his friend died in his place, the day the crew saved the ship through courage and skill and determination. That story, multiplied across hundreds of crew members, thousands of sailors, represents the truth about USS Enterprise. She survived not because her design was superior, though it was good. She survived not because she was lucky, though luck played a role. She survived because her crew refused to let her sink. The irony that opens this story resolves in the statistics and the narrative. Critics in 1938, when Enterprise was commissioned, predicted that carriers would be vulnerable to air attack and surface gunfire. They were correct. Carriers were vulnerable, but Enterprise proved that vulnerability could be managed through preparation, training, and execution. She absorbed attacks that would have sunk lesser ships. She fought through damage that would have forced lesser crews to abandon ship. She remained operational through conditions that would have grounded lesser air groups. The critics missed what couldn't be quantified in displacement tonnage or armor thickness or gun caliber. They missed the human element, the crew's training, the officers' leadership, the institutional culture that made damage control a warfighting skill rather than a maintenance function. These intangibles made Enterprise the most successful carrier in American naval history. May 14, 1945 was not Enterprise's finest hour. That distinction belongs to other battles. Midway, where her dive bombers turned the tide of the Pacific War. Santa Cruz, where she kept fighting after Hornet was sunk. Guadalcanal, where she operated as the only American carrier in the South Pacific. Philippine Sea, where her aircraft destroyed dozens of Japanese planes in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. But May 14th was Enterprise's final test, the last time her crew would fight to save her, the last time damage control parties would charge into smoke and fire to patch holes and suppress flames, the last time she would prove that a well-trained crew aboard an obsolete ship could survive attacks that destroyed newer, larger, more heavily armed vessels. 14 men died that morning, 68 were wounded. 1 carrier was knocked out of the war, but Enterprise survived. Her crew saved her one final time. And 3 months later, when Japan surrendered, the oldest American fleet carrier was ready to return to combat, fully repaired, fully armed, fully operational. She never got the chance. The war ended before she could prove, once more, that age and obsolescence meant nothing compared to crew quality and fighting spirit. The Gray Ghost, they called her, the ship that refused to die, 6 times damaged, 6 times repaired, 6 times returned to combat, until the 7th time when there was no more combat to return to. USS Enterprise, CV-6, the most decorated warship in United States Navy history, finished the war not at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean where critics predicted she would end, but tied to a pier in Puget Sound Navy Yard, fully operational, ready to fight, with no enemy left to fight. That was her ultimate victory. Not destruction in battle, not a glorious death defending the fleet, but survival. Survival when everyone predicted she would be sunk. Survival through preparation, training, courage, and the absolute determination of her crew to keep their ship afloat no matter what the enemy threw at them. George Barker died for that survival. 13 other men died for it. Hundreds were wounded for it. And thousands of crew members across 4 years of war made it possible through work that was exhausting, dangerous, and absolutely essential. They saved the Big E not once, 6 times. And on the morning of May 14, 1945, when Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu's bomb exploded 6 decks below the waterline and hurled the forward elevator 400 feet into the air, they saved her again. One last time, because that's what the crew of USS Enterprise did. They saved their ship, no matter what.